Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. It's my privilege today to be joined by Dr. Diane Sommerville, who is an associate professor of history at Binghamton University, and most recently is an author of an article entitled A Burden Too Heavy to Bear, War Trauma, Suicide, and Confederate Soldiers, which is now out in the December 2013 issue of Civil War History, which is actually a special issue on the trauma of war. So, Dr. Sommerville, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I wonder if you could perhaps start us with just a brief overview, in essence, of what this article is really trying to get at, and then we'll get at some more of the particulars here eventually.
Of course. The article is on suicide and specifically and generally about emotional and psychological suffering of Confederate soldiers. And suicide is a topic that until very recently has gone under the radar of most American historians. Of course, Eric Dean introduced the topic of psychological impairment of Civil War soldiers in his book, Shook Over Hell. But very little has been done on studying Confederate soldiers, in part because of the sources. So this is very much an attempt to try to understand the impact of the war on the psychological well-being of Confederate soldiers and exploring those cases where soldiers either did take their own lives, attempted to take their own lives, or were hospitalized, institutionalized because of concerns that they might.
I wonder if you could perhaps begin to discuss just a little bit the idea of language, and you address this kind of right at the beginning of your article, that you make a concerted effort, that you say you're going to use the term, the phrasing war trauma as opposed to PTSD, which I think is something that certainly in today's day and age we hear a lot about increasingly in the news. So I wonder why you chose, if you could share with your readers, your rationalization behind that phrasing of war trauma.
Of course. In fact, my very first article on Confederate veterans, I do use this language of PTSD, but it was only after further research, including studies of contemporary American soldiers out of the Middle East wars, where I began to realize that it's a misused term in diagnosis. It's incorrect in some ways because some of my soldiers commit suicide on the way to the front. They never see battle. So they can't have committed suicide because of what they saw, because they weren't at the front. And PTSD specifically is situated as a diagnosis that is a response to observed trauma. And my soldiers didn't do that. Some of my soldiers were actually those who appear to have been driven to kill themselves because of an anxiety or what other historians have called fear reaction. So the term war trauma actually is an umbrella term that encompasses not only these fear reactions, but also what we might call today TBI or TBI, traumatic brain injury. Studies today show that it's very difficult to discern differences between those manifestations of mental illness from their physiological or psychological origins. In other words, they overlap a great deal and they mimic one another. So even today, physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists have great difficulty teasing that out when they're trying to treat soldiers. And so for me, it's even more difficult because I'm removed by over 100 years, so I can't possibly diagnose. So I think war trauma is a better umbrella term. It's less specific, but it gives me some assurances that even though I don't know what exactly is going on, it does fall into this category of some kind of psychological trauma that has some relationship to the war experience.
Now, you've already alluded to this, but one of the things that I found to be most fascinating about this article is the challenges you faced as an historian regarding source material and kind of access to this. There's not some synthesis of these accounts that were, combined and packaged neatly, like, in the North in the post-war period, albeit maybe they were underreported in the North, but they were at least reported. So
Exactly.
You face this challenge of trying to really find this hodgepodge of sources to pull together some semblance of a coherent narrative, which you do exceptionally well, I might add. But I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on kind of how you approached this topic from that standpoint of a challenge of access to source material.
Of course. Well, for example, referring back to Eric Dean, whose study focused primarily on Northern soldiers. Two things. Number one, the Surgeon General of the United States actually put together a multi-volume report of the medical history of the Union soldiers, the Federal soldiers. And in that report, there are instances of suicide. There is no analog for the Confederate States Army. There was no such report. So officially, it's not reported in any place. The other thing is that Northern soldiers, as part of the U.S. Army, were given, those who survived were given pensions. And those pension records actually lead people to find, evidence of treatment well after the war. And that's what Dean does. He goes to an Indiana Veterans Hospital where he finds a lot of cases of mental illness of Union soldiers. Again, pensions were not uniformly distributed in the former Confederate States. So I had to be a little bit creative here. So one of the things that kind of surprised me was that I found sources in newspapers. I expected there to be virtual silence on suicide in newspapers, especially during the war. That was not the case. There were many suicides of soldiers that were reported, and as I note in my article, were treated very sympathetically. The other thing that I did was I expanded my definition of suicide to suicidal behavior. And so in this regard, there could be soldiers who had to be institutionalized. And when I go to those records, I can sometimes find evidence that they were suicidal or attempting to harm themselves. The problem, again, of sources is that you would think that the caregivers would note in their medical histories that they were soldiers. They typically don't do that, which was one of the really interesting findings I think I make clear in the article. And so I have to then go back and try to take the names of these soldiers, if they're of the age that they could have been in the war, and then try to find them. And it is a huge puzzle. Sometimes I'm lucky, sometimes I'm not. The recent digitization and subscription services like Ancestry.com and Fold3.com have been immensely helpful in helping me match up names of asylum patients with soldiers and finding out about their experience. And then I can understand the connection, even though it might have been lost in the caregivers at the asylum.
Now, what were some of these triggers, if you will, for some of your soldiers in terms of committing suicide? Because as you have alluded to already, and certainly over the course of the article, there's a wide array of people here. Many of them are taking their own lives before they even reach the front.
Sure. So before I speak to that, maybe I should just talk a little bit about how difficult it is for me as a historian to grapple with this notion of causation. How does one ever know why someone commits suicide? Even today, we're not entirely sure, even if somebody leaves a letter or a note, that's why they committed suicide. So it's very difficult. But what I think Howard Kushner worked with me a little bit on this. He pointed out that at the very least, the war and its experience actually was at least an underlying cause of these suicides. In other words, the one thing that they all had in common was they took place in the war arena. That said, and again, I can't say with great authority that I know that these are the reasons that caused men to kill themselves. But circumstances, and sometimes the people around them, believe that the cause of suicide was oftentimes nostalgia. Nostalgia was, in fact, a medical term that was used in the 19th century to describe somebody who was longing for home and who exhibited physiological ailments, like heart palpitations, and basically a failure to thrive. And it seems to me that in the cases where these young men who were in camps, who killed themselves before going to the front, that might have had something to do with their suicides, that they were, for the first time in their lives, away from home, away from their town or county, and this was very, very frightening for them. So I think that was one trigger. Another trigger, I think one of the greatest triggers for suicidal behavior among Confederate soldiers was this anxiety about performance, which is to say, Southerners, of course, were steeped in this honor culture. For men, this was one of the greatest challenges for them, which is to go into battle, to prove themselves, to demonstrate how brave they were. Many of them worried that they wouldn't be able to perform to that standard. And so I think the anxiety about that performance in battle sometimes led them to prefer to kill themselves rather than to go into battle and fail. And then they might be tainted as cowards, which was something that a mantle that they didn't want to bear. Another cause seemed to have been occasionally word from home that a wife, a child had died. The connection, as today, war is a very difficult experience, and being away from home is very stressful. And I think it was even more difficult for Civil War soldiers because they felt that they were being pulled in two directions. They were being called by their nation to perform their duty and to protect their homeland. But by the same time, by doing that, they were abandoning their charges, their wives, their children. And so for many of them, it was tremendously difficult to be away from home. So when somebody dies, like I have a Louisiana captain, I think, who hears that his young wife has died, he kills himself. I mean, these are one of the few connections to an outside world away from wars. You know, I'm looking forward to going home. And when that is taken away, sometimes that's the last vestige of potential happiness and pulling oneself away from the situation. And that when that goes away, sometimes it takes away their will to live.
And now you do allude to the fact that there are some efforts within the Confederacy to identify some of these soldiers who might be viewed as somewhat unstable. And I wondered if you could perhaps describe what were some of the kind of the best practices, I guess, the efforts that the Confederacy put in place to try to identify some of these soldiers who, I guess unstable is probably not the best word, but were somewhat problematic,
Yes.
and they feared for their safety and perhaps others.
Yeah, to be honest, there really weren't any. Even there were some observations made by physicians and military officers in the North that there were people in the Army who shouldn't be in the Army, and this pertains especially to very young soldiers. There's a Northern officer who says, look, you know, these teenage boys shouldn't be here, and they're really at risk for falling apart. But there's no discussion of this in the South. And I think, and I do make the case that part of why I think these young men break, especially in camp, emotionally that is that they got caught up in that rage militaire that propelled all young men to, with great fervor, to go to fight this war. And their women folk pushed them out the door or shamed them into going. And so they didn't have time to think about it logically. But when they got to camp, they then had a lot of time in their hands because there's drilling and you can only drill for so many hours a day. And then they had downtime and maybe had a lot of time to think. So I think that partly explains why a number of these young men do fall apart before they get to battle. But the notion of identifying potentially mentally what they would consider weak individuals doesn't really happen until World War I and after. Americans in World War I were aware of what had happened with the British, and they made some attempts, but they were largely, I think, unsuccessful. I also think that in the case of the Confederacy, all hands on deck, right? I mean, they needed every eligible man. And if there was, unless there was an extraordinary case of mental illness where one was completely incapacitated, it seems unlikely to me that that would be an excuse to not either permit or to hold this man back from military service. I've encountered examples of young men who end up either killing themselves or in asylums that had been in the asylums before the war. So there didn't appear to be any kind of screening system whatsoever to keep potential risks out of the Army. That's not a convention until the 20th century.
And finally, Dr. Sommerville, I guess I'll let you go on this question. Obviously, this article is part of a larger project, and I wondered if you might want to speak just a little bit about kind of where you see this as a whole going, because this is just one kind of snippet of it.
Of course. I'm working on my last chapter, which is women after the war, wives, essentially, of these Civil War veterans after the war. But as I conceived the book, it's about a 7-chapter book. I have 2 chapters, during the war, the soldiers and the home front. And then I have 2 chapters on slaves and freedmen. And then I have 2 chapters on veterans and their families after the Civil War. So I look at the impact of all of this psychological damage and in how they're trying to reconstitute their families and their lives. And then a final chapter that looks at kind of the sweeping place of suicide in Southern society to show, among other things, that notions of suicide, the taboos that we affiliate with suicide in early American history, did give way to some level of tolerance. And I think that Civil War is very important in that intervention. David Silkenit has a relatively new book out that talks about this as well, and he writes about North Carolina soldiers. So I think my work is very much in keeping with his. But my chapters on slaves and freedmen also help me identify the importance of suicide kind of as a cultural marker. I'm trying to understand the meaning of this change of suicide. And I think what it does is it helps Southerners develop a notion of who they are as Southerners after the war. And you can see in certain venues how suicide becomes very romantic and heroic well after the war. So I have this great story that's recounted in memoirs in the early 20th century about a rebel sympathizer who is in South Carolina, I believe, on the coast, under occupied soil. And she gets into a bit of a trash talking with some of the Federal soldiers who are there about Lincoln's death. And she is, indignant, and he basically says he got what he deserved. And of course, this infuriates the soldiers. They go rampaging through her house, and they tear her house up. And they end up saying, look, you have to display funeral bunting on your veranda. And she refuses, and they negotiate, and she ends up saying, I'll do it, but I want everybody to relocate across the street. Everybody moves across the street. She goes into her home. She comes out, and she's fully dressed in her mourning clothes. She had lost both her husband and her 15-year-old son in the war. And she has this bunting draped around her neck, and she climbs onto a chair to seemingly drape it over the fretwork on her veranda. But instead what she does is she hangs herself. And of course, all of the people across the street are horrified. But the moral of this story is, here's a woman who is resistant to the last, and she is a martyr to the lost cause. And that's not the kind of stories that were circulating about suicide well before the war. So my book, I think, will link those two and talk about what changes in Southerners' identities and how suicide plays a role in that.
Sounds like a wonderful book that will be coming down the pipeline, Dr. Sommerville. So thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us. Again, everyone, the article title is A Burden Too Heavy to Bear, War Trauma, Suicide, and Confederate Soldiers in the most recent issue of Civil War History. I advise you to subscribe if you don't already. It's a great journal, particularly their December special issues that they put out. This one last year was an environmental history issue. It's really something spectacular. But Dr. Sommerville, again, thanks so much, and perhaps we can have you back on again to talk about the book when it comes out.
I'd love to, Dave. Thank you for having me.